Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our 5th Manchester Meetup. I'm Terry Lockwood, and I'm part of the EPAM's European API practice, and I'll be the lead this evening, assisted by Yeva. The goal of these meetups is to build a vibrant and self-sustaining Mule developer community in the region and foster engagement, and this is really important for all ongoing meetups. And of course, to evangelize and wherever possible, think about real-world MuleSoft delivery experiences, and it's key that you as attendees, add wherever you can, and we're always looking forward to seeing more people present at these. So think about what you can offer yourselves to these meetups, but let's move on and just do the housekeeping before we start. All the attendees are going to be muted. You can write your questions in the chat or let us know your wish to be unmuted, whichever way suits you. The event's going to be recorded and uploaded to YouTube. You'll all receive the link to the slides and recording after the event via email. And at the end, we'll take a group picture. We haven't done this many times, so please bear with us because we will need to grant everyone's speakers rights so you can open your cameras. But it's worth getting a picture of everybody. At the end of the evening, we'll select 3 winners randomly who will get a free MuleSoft training course of their choice, and winners will be announced via post-event email, and that's going to be based on the kind of questions of people that ask questions. So the agenda for this evening, will start in a few moments with our first speaker, and that's Venkata from Rathbone Brothers. His presentation is called Graph API with MuleSoft. That will be followed at 6:50 by Angel, who's a customer success architect at MuleSoft and an old colleague of mine from the Ricston days, and some of his old co-workers will start on the call tonight. His presentation is called the Top 10 Most Common Integration Challenges. So these look two really interesting sessions. So let's remember questions at the end of each session, and I'll do my best to record the questions as you potentially put them in chat. And the evening is probably likely to wrap up around 7:30, 7:35 p.m. Look, we have a great evening ahead, and for the sake of progress, we'll hold all questions, as I've said, to the end, so we don't interrupt the speakers. Otherwise, the speakers will have to speak for an awful long time. So let's move forward, and it's time for me to hand over to Venkata. Venkata.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Terry. Thanks, Terry and Iva. I'm glad that I'm presenting again at the Manchester MuleSoft event. So it was very good. I was happy to be in the MuleSoft community for a while now, nearly 5 years, and the Mule 4 journey started with the Mule 4 journey since the beginning days of the Mule 4. Moved on to Wishworks now recently. Been a long journey with Rathbones, and appreciated everyone who helped me come across this. So I would like to present Graph API today. It's a Microsoft Graph API, just to be specific. So the advantages of Graph API over conventional IMAPs, SMTP, and POP connectors. Yeah. Sorry, just 1 second. Yeah, it's a MuleSoft email integration. I think most of us know we use regularly on a daily basis. We use SMTP connectors to send the emails, and some of us use the email integration to read the emails and process them and send the secure messages across to the destinations wherever we intend to do it. Graph API it's a Microsoft Graph API actually. It's been released in 2015, but hasn't got very much popular until lately with MuleSoft. So the MuleSoft integration with the Microsoft Graph API seems to be very interesting, really. I'm sure some of you might have used in the previous projects. I believe that everything is in one place, so you don't need to use the connectors. You might agree or disagree, but some of us might want to use the HTTP as a standard connector as a REST protocol instead of using conventional or quite a few connectors we got available in the market. So we got IMAPS connector available, POP4 connector available with the MuleSoft, and they got different functionalities. Yeah. So moving on to the context. So it's basically.
Sorry, Venkata, could you enter the presenting mode on the PowerPoint? It's on the top, the presenting mode, you know, like so. Top left.
Oops, sorry. Yeah, sorry, that's right. Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you. So moving on to the context, actually, it's a MuleSoft email integration using the Microsoft Graph API features. It's Microsoft Graph API. The advantage with this is to mention not just the email integration, but today's topic, we're going to be touching on email integration. With the Outlook emails in a company, really, we can, using the MuleSoft and the features of the Microsoft Graph API, we can actually integrate the calendars, events, profiles, Azure connectors like Azure Access, things like that. There's quite a few advantages of using the Microsoft Graph API. It's not just limited to the emails, really. And so just moving on to the context of it, really. So it's much easier, like I mentioned earlier, it's much easier now without connectors, using the connectors like IMAPS or POP4, because if we want to do a secure connection over SSL, we can still achieve that using the HTTP connector on here, and we can use, and this supports authentication too, because I'm sure most of you might come across every integration now requires kind of authentication now. With the HTTP is quite built now. The latest version of HTTP request is quite built for the authentication, or we can use obviously the caching mechanism for the authentication access tokens. And the batching is a very interesting feature in Graph API, Microsoft Graph API. It's not the batching, I'm not talking about the batching of the MuleSoft, it's the batching behavior of the Graph API, Microsoft Graph API. So we can send small chunks of request in one go. So in one post request, we can actually send and receive an email. That's one of the cool features which you can find with the Microsoft Graph API, which the heavy integrations or kind of ETL operations with using sending the emails across, it can be achieved with the Graph API, but process, but it has some limitations that it can't support huge amount of data and big attachments with the batching process. The memory management, of course, it is quite useful in terms of managing the memory compared to the connectors like IMAPS, like I mentioned, the POP connectors within the MuleSoft. Yeah, and create folders, calendar integration, things like that. And a pagination. Pagination is very interesting, really, in the Graph API. Microsoft Graph API, when we read an email, actually, if you don't mention any sort of pagination, it gives 10 results by default. That's Microsoft has given that. So it has two different paginations, like client-driven. So we can define our pagination really in the MuleSoft. By default, it has like 10 results set, and we can read and write the attachments. That's obviously it's one of the features. IMAPS feature as a read and write is sending back emails, SMTP. So I mean, I have actually done a POC and I worked on it a while ago. So it's quite easy in 2 steps as I perceived it. You just get an access token with the tenant ID and then perform the request. It supports all sorts of requests like get, post, patch, and other put request and all sorts of requests really. So all I want to do is, let's say example, I want to read an email from an inbox. I want to get a message ID of it. And then after I process the email, I want to confirm it that the email has to be marked as read so that I don't do a duplicate processing. So it has all sorts of requests we can perform with using the Microsoft Graph API with the MuleSoft. So I got a sample RAML on here. So we can actually use the traits like OAuth2 and the pageable pagination as well. And so let's say I used messages to get them, and then I want to get by message ID, a particular message ID, I can use it. And yeah, of course. And I want to mark the email as read, so I can do a patch request with authentication 2 again. So it's basically caching the token and then performing it. So just before coming on to it, yeah, I can actually quickly what I could say. So I listen to the, I put a listener on here. So this is my request with necessary parameters where I can send across. So I think most of you might know that it actually accepts URL encoded parameter as a header with the Microsoft services where we need to connect them. So this is quite important when we get the access token. So we get the access token here, and then we perform a request, and obviously we're going to get the result set out. So I have actually added on here the size of the payload because obviously I want to see how much result set I'm going to get out here. So let's see, just a quick one. I think it's already in a deployed mode. Yeah, so I got result set of 10 actually on here. So because I haven't mentioned anything, number of messages which I read. So we can do almost all the features similar to using the IMAPS connector in reading the messages across, and then we process them across. Similarly, yeah, let's on the slide again. So advantages and disadvantages. I would like to stress on some of the advantages and of course disadvantages. So like I mentioned, it replaces the connectors like IMAPS, POP, and config issues. I'm not sure many of you worked with IMAPS connector. There were some config issues in the early versions of Mule 4, but now they've been resolved now. But still, connector issues can be resolved using this Graph API, taking advantage of Graph API, because I believe most of the organizations these days are using the Outlook Office 365 really, so it makes it more reliable and easy. And also, we do not need to change the configurations within the email configurations, so that the organizational security is maintained using this Graph, taking advantage of Graph API. And the base64 binary content is retained actually within the HTTP request. So the reason I stressed on that point, base64 contents. So there was a bug in the IMAPS connectors, which I guess it might have fixed now. So some of the base64 content is auto transformed to JSON is an Excel file, but I don't find that bug in using the Microsoft Graph API really. And the batch processing, like I mentioned earlier, it's quite useful to use the batch processing. And MuleSoft can be used to integrate using the Graph API to like Azure calendars. I can actually give like pop-ups like when is my meeting's going to be due. My calendar, actually it integrates the calendar quite effectively, and any other apps really within the Microsoft within the Office 365. Yeah, disadvantages. I would like to see that there are quite a few disadvantages in here. The first disadvantage is Microsoft only. So because this Graph API is a product of Microsoft, so we can only integrate with an Outlook email. SMTP operation also requires security authentication. I think most of us has come across SMTP so many times in the MuleSoft space. SMTP doesn't usually require quite a lot of authentication, but this operation requires same authentication as the sending an email, processing an email authentication. So I would see this as a disadvantage, because most of the SMTP operations were done, if not indicated, they don't need to be done over SSL unless it is indicated as a security feature. Custom error mapping. So the error mappings, obviously, because when we use the connectors like IMAP, so we use it actually gives us errors retrieving the emails. But in here, all we get is HTTP bad request or all HTTP related errors. Really, we need to make the custom error mappings based on what the error is gonna be. It can't replace the listener. So that's one disadvantage, because we have the listeners with the email integrations, IMAP listener, like reading to the oncoming messages. So obviously it has to work with the scheduler. That's one of the features disadvantages I found. So like if I come across the SMTP feature as well, let's say if I'm sending an SMTP feature, again, sending an email across. So I will just touch on that SMTP, which is sending an email basically. Sorry, I think I used the send message. Oh, it has some errors, yeah. So anyway, it's got some cool features where I have tried earlier, where I can get some messages into the space where it can actually come into the like you can see. So the other advantage with this is you can actually try your Graph Explorer within the you can use the Graph Explorer to send the emails to do a POC actually before starting in the MuleSoft, and we can use the similar sort of situation where we can actually use the same URLs which we can actually encrypt within the MuleSoft space. So as you can see, it's got quite a lot of them. We can use quite a few endpoints actually within them. Like all items in my drive, get my mail, things like that, and my manager, my to-do tasks, really. They are quite handy. And just a little bit touching on configuration, yes, it requires us to register an API actually within the Graph, Microsoft Graph, and we need to give the necessary permissions, as you can see on the screen now. Some of the permissions like mail read and mail send permissions, and you can actually give it to exactly whichever user which is needed for sending an email across. And going back on there, yeah, and we got quite a few links available in the Microsoft site where we can take advantage of the Graph API, Microsoft Graph API. To stress on that point as Microsoft Graph API, because so most of the products have their own Graph APIs, and there's quite a few connectors available, like endpoints available within the Microsoft Graph API for sending and receiving the emails. Receiving the emails in the sense like processing the emails. They're quite useful in terms of email integration. Really, I mean, I would really say that will take us to the next point where we don't need to use the connectors in most cases. I'm sure you might have more doubts who has used the SMTP connectors. I have a doubt myself. Okay, SMTP connector has a base 64 encoding, auto transfer encoding in it, but in the Graph API, we definitely have to mention the encoding and the MIME types separately. But some of the SMTP, it does transfer the MIME types automatically. That's it from me. Any questions?
There's no questions in chat, Venkata, unless anybody would like to ask a question. No? Thank you. I think we're all finished, Venkata. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you, everyone.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Angel, are you ready to present?
Yeah, Venkata, if you can please stop the sharing the screen, and I will be able to start presenting as well. Let me turn this one on. Excellent. Let's start with the screen. Okay, good. Are you able to see my screen? Terry, Eva, Venkata, can you confirm? Okay,
Yes.
excellent. Thank you very much. With that, we're going to start the session, my session this time. I'm just a meetup leader, just the people orchestrating, but today I'm going to give you a quick session on 10 common integration challenges. So first of all, good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever in the world you're tuning in from. And again, thank you for joining. And thank you to the organizers, Eva, Terry, thank you, Kevin, as well. With that, I think I'm ready to actually start a quick introduction. Just so you know, I'm Angela Ricci, MuleSoft Customer Success Architect. I'm based here in London, UK, and I'm going to give you a very quick brief about my experience so far. I was born in Venezuela. If you're interested, you can Google the Angels Falls. If you are someone that likes nature, you're going to be fascinated by it. I'm from the professional side, it's more than 10 years in the IT field, mostly related to development, including delivery, consultancy, and now customer success. I was actually at some point, because this is all related to backend software engineering, I was working as well as some kind of full stack, but not really, working with jQuery, with Angular.js, Backbone.js. And thanks to that, I managed to get from 20 degrees sunny Caracas, Venezuela, to the middle of the winter in Chicago. It was around minus 26. I had never been in a winter before, and getting into a city where it's minus 26 was crazy, but I really enjoyed it. So a little bit about the experience there in the companies, related to companies. I worked for IBM at the beginning, then at the startup in Chicago was Open Bravo, ClearDrop as well, then Addison Lee here in London, and you have there that I work for Ricston, as Terry mentioned, and for MuleSoft. In Ricston, I met one of the people that I admire, is Kevin Jervis. He's actually with us today. I'm very happy to see you there, Kevin. And just to drop my age, I started with Mule when it was Mule 373, if anyone can remember, MMC maybe. That's more than 5 years ago already. Okay, so you're not here to listen to me about talking about myself. We are going to go into very interesting challenges that people face in the industry. These are challenges that I compiled from actual work that I do every day with my customers. And before we start, what we are not going to see today, the reason why I'm putting this slide is because sometimes you get these out-of-the-box recommendations, and I just want to open the questions here a bit, reasoning, so you keep it in mind next time that you go into a conversation like this. On the first one, we think about versioning. So when we say versioning, we assume that the latest is the greatest, or at least that's what we're told. And the question will be, is it really? And I want to give you some insight of what MuleSoft is doing, that the direction is taking. One of the main goals right now is to actually reduce the numbers of versions that you have for the Mule runtimes. And this is something that you're probably aware if you've been in the space for more than 2 years. It's some work that is still in progress. The idea behind it is, imagine that you need to fix or amend a bug for a specific Mule runtime version, and you have 100 of those. How can you focus on quality? How can you focus on giving the best to the customers if you have more than 100 issues with a finite number of time and engineers allocated? So that's one of the approaches that MuleSoft is taking around the versioning. I'm not here to speak fully about it, but keep it in mind. Also for the testing, imagine testing 100 Mule runtimes with all the connectors and so forth, against testing with around 10 or 8, or even the latest that, as you have seen. So that point there is just to give you a question to yourself. Is it better to always update to the latest? Is this a good direction? You can judge it. The second point is in MuleSoft training plans. taking a 5 days full training so that you can save around 6 months of learning by yourself. I know this is boring, this is repeated, but keep in mind, I was a developer, just like many of you may be now, or architects as well. And working on the field, when you do get the training, get those 5 days, you can save not necessarily 6 months, but you can save a lot of problems along the way. Okay, tier 1, we do have the automation. Everything needs to be 80% tested, code coverage. What happens if you are joining a project that has 0 testing? What are you going to do? How are you going to get up to speed to deliver something that has a deadline, but also get the testing done? Are you creating the test only for the new functionality, or is it going to be for everything? Or maybe you're going to prioritize core business APIs. So think about an e-commerce. In the e-commerce, what is more important? To be able to upload the profile picture for a consumer, or the consumer to be able to, in their profile, see the tracking ID of their order? You probably guess it's the second one. And that's where we need to think about when we think about testing practices in environments that doesn't have it. Again, this is because these best practices out of the box, they don't always apply in the sense that they are recommended to us. And I just wanted to give you some insight. The second 2 points are very interesting. MuleSoft recommended support. Many of you should know about this one already. If you are opening any support case with MuleSoft, you have to check that link there. You will see the workflow that is actually made by Kevin Jervis and Sebastian Baltrini more than 3 years ago. But you will see the different ways of diagnosing and troubleshooting issues. And lastly, the other resource that I'm not going to talk about is Advanced Troubleshooting of Application Performance. This is a 90-minute masterclass from Vitali. He's a senior, one of the top support engineers back in Australia from MuleSoft. And he did 90 minutes talking through the JVM, the memory distribution, execution engine, DOMs, and getting applications ready, some proactive troubleshooting. He has been working with performance exclusively for more than 10 years, so that is a session that is definitely worth looking at. So we talk about what we are not going to see today. What we're going to see is the case studies. We're going to see 10 case studies. The first 3, you're going to be in the shoes of the person that is struggling with the issue. In the other, from 4 to 5, you're going to see briefly what was going on in the situation and what kind of workarounds or strategies you can take if you ever happen to be in that situation. And lastly, we're going to have a special mentions. This will be very fast topics that are still an issue for my customers today, and I want to make sure that you have an idea if you face any of those later on. With that, then we do the closing words and we open for the questions. With that said, we're going to focus on the first case study. This one is about performance, a topic that everyone is interested in. And this is a customer that is based in Spain. That's where you can see the Spanish flag there and one of the buildings in Madrid. So this company has more than 4,000 employees and they're managing more than 2,000 restaurants. It's definitely not a small company. And now what happens is that you're sitting down at your desk in the office. Let's imagine it's a normal day. You're close to your lunchtime. You're working on a couple of tasks. You need to finish soon, but you're suddenly pulled into a production outage thread for one of your customers. You have to drop everything else that you were doing right now, and you have less than 3 hours to prepare for the session. And you're going to have a war room with this customer. And it's not clear what is the actual issue. Okay, that doesn't sound very helpful, right? Then what happens next? In point number 2, you can see you read through the case. There is not much information anyways. And the case doesn't have anything attached to it. There are some clues about API-led applications and some SAP backend. On point number 3, from the support case, you can tell that this customer is fairly new to MuleSoft and they did not have a proper onboarding. This onboarding could have been done with a partner, with a business partner, with MuleSoft Professional Services, but in this case, our customer doesn't know even about the MuleSoft recommended support process. On point number 4, the issue has been going at least for 2 weeks, and it has not been solved. The question raised there, the red flag that you can see, is this really a critical issue? Okay, now what happens is that you're going to do the last bit of information input you can get. You read through the email chain in a desperate attempt to understand what is going on. You see that the customer is presenting, if we talk about architecture, the person A should be your contact. If you want to analyze the code, we should include the partner 1 in the loop. If you want to analyze SAP BAPI called through MuleSoft, we should include the person B. And if you want to review the impact of the SAP resources or SAP behavior, person C will take the lead. What you can see there, it's very hard from someone coming externally that is not part of their delivery teams, their partner team, to come and understand what all of this segmentation is about. You can tell, at least from my point of view, this is another red flag. This should have been done internally, this analysis with the different people, and some kind of triage process should have taken place. It doesn't seem that it happened. So what you do, what else can you do? You offer to schedule a meeting in 3 hours. It's as much as you can get to prepare. You immediately create a diagram, some sort of diagram, a draft maybe, to validate you understand the issue. And you also share 2 resources to be reviewed. The diagram, you can see it in the right. It's a quick draft I put together. I really had no idea what the system, how the system was, or historical of the customer. So you put the API led, you put the three APIs there, and you assume that the issue could happen in anywhere, can happen anywhere because you don't have the details. Besides that, putting that draft together, you also get the MuleSoft recommended support process that we talked before. There's 3 points. There's the problems in Cloud Hub troubleshooting, problems in SAP, and problems with the connectors. So you're going to put those resources together and you're going to send it to the customer to see if this helps. A reference guide to the Mule performance as well, the Mule performance tuning. If you haven't seen it, that was a 60 pages or so document for Mule 3 when you were tuning performance, because you had much more freedom into the threading or much more responsibility, depending on how you want to see it. Moving on, what else can you do? You still have a couple of hours before the session, and you need to think about how you're going to onboard that session. So in this screen, you can actually see some of the questions I put together in my mind, things that you can ask. I was desperate to understand how could I understand the issue. So you can read information about the issue, what APIs are being unresponsive on Monday between 9 and 14. This was something that was added in the email, and one of the pieces of data I could extract. That was an issue happening on Mondays. Then you have other questions like, has there any change in the load balancers or the confirmation of the versions they were using? They had something else on-prem as well. That's the reason what these questions were asked. So after you put the list of questions, you're prepared to send the email, but before you do that, you extend it a little bit more. You create some sections. So first, you're thinking about what is the issue, then what has been done to work on the issue, and then what is the behavior or anything that has changed in the last 2 weeks. These are all questions that I put together and that I actually run through a customer on the call. But progress, that call doesn't happen, and that's another red flag. You are 1 hour away from this very important call, and you get an email saying that person A and person B are on PTO and the call won't be possible. So again, it's postponed for one week. So was it really urgent? It's still an intermittent issue happening on Mondays on production. That's the information you have. Different people start replying to the email change with answers for questions on their scope. This is very challenging. If you ever write an email, as I did here, with so many questions, that you were expecting to cover in a call, you're going to start getting replies by each person answering one or two of the questions, and then you have to consolidate all of that in a document. Don't ever do that. Put the document straight away, and then you can work around it. Anyways, from the lessons learned, we move on to the what happens next. You get into a war room. There's 15 other people there. You are the only person from MuleSoft, and the conversation starts to deviate a lot from the main points that you actually highlighted, or the main points has related to the outage from the MuleSoft side. And you see that there's a lot of interaction between the internal teams, the people from databases, from SAP, from the partner, from the architecture team. And at least you see that interaction. But you cannot gather all the information that you needed. You still manage to get a part of it. The issue happens on Monday between 9 to 14. There is a MuleSoft system API that makes requests to the SAP backend system. We already have ideas of those. But what happens next is that the company knew that their backend system was a slow backend system, SAP backend system, because of the implementation they had. And there were plans to modify it maybe in 6 months in the future so that they could improve the performance. And another of the suspects, because that's already a red flag, another red flag, the backend system being slow, it's something that we need to manage if that happens. The other potential culprit was the client. By the client, they refer to the front-end application or the MuleSoft APIs, meaning that they were not creating or handling the connections properly, having zombie calls, maybe some memory leaks, and so forth. But there were no conclusive proof or evidence of that as of yet. I'm not going to bore you with the details of the go back and forth because I want you to get the lessons. So there was a lot of email exchange, meetings, new support cases coming, etc. Retrospective, the issues were actually solved by these 6 main points. So the first one is about diagnosing through dumps. You diagnose to a thread dump, to a head dump. You understand how the memory is working, how the Java classes are actually working in your worker, for example. You can request it through the support case if you need to. The second one is on performance tuning. Specifically, the threading strategy. What happens is that it's not actual performance tuning in this case. It was more about playing with the number of threads. And I'm not saying that it's not performance tuning because it worked and it was done in production, but you don't want to be there. You want to do those tests in any testing seed staging environment that you have in before. The third one was cache. There was no cache at all, no any kind of cache, considering that 40% of the requests to the SAP system were actually gets, and there were some of them that were repeated. What happens here, you implement cache and you can save some time for your backend system, especially if your backend system is one of the bottlenecks. There were also some improvements on the backend system on their end. That was, again, the biggest bottleneck for the response time. There was a lack of monitoring knowledge, things like what happens when a worker restarts automatically, or how you can see the memory, the CPU on a specific time. And lastly, and this one is important as well, a reconfiguration of the timeouts in the platform. So think about your system API. How are you defining a timeout? If you make it shorter, it may be that you're taking out 20% of the longest transactions that they were taking too long for your system, and we're actually tampering the whole of your APIs. Or it may be that you're setting up the time on too little and you're making 50% of your requests fail to the backend system that you know that is slow. In this case, they were using the default ones in some of the APIs, and they needed to actually change it. So lessons learned here, we're already 11 minutes in this case, and lessons learned is the MuleSoft recommended support process is there to help you. If you're aware of it, good. If you haven't seen it, please, after this call, that's the first thing you should do. Check it out, check the troubleshooting that there is there. and think about how that can help you in the future. There's also the workflow on how you work with the support team. Now, the second point is the Mule 4.3. There is a white paper that was released. It's not as in-depth as the Mule 3 white paper, but it will help you understanding how the engine works and what are some of the expectations that you need to have about it. And lastly, there's a documentation that is extremely useful that was added not that long ago on the documentation portal site. That is how you do the performance tuning. What are some recommendations? Think about repeatable versus not repeatable streaming, back pressure and max concurrency, backend server's response time, one of the ones we mentioned, caching, we mentioned it as well, pulling profiles, domains, logging, batch processing, application design best practices. If you're not aware of any of this, you can check that webpage and you will get some basic recommendations on making the tuning in these different areas. Again, the straight out of the box recommendation, get everything 80% tested and get all of this. Every single test that you see in the screen for every single API is not realistic. That's not business viable. So it's not feasible. What we can think of, check your use case, check how you can try to make things better in your software development lifecycle. And we know that it's not always possible. So give priority to the APIs that deserve it. And think about the test that you need to have at different periods of time. An endurance test is very important. We're going to see that later today. Now, I promised the next two are going to be shorter. This is the case study number 2. This is the search day. We're moving from Spain, Madrid, to actually this is Atlanta in United States. And we're going to move into a coffee house company. It's around 50,000 employees. It's around 30 countries that they are serving, and they're actually preparing for a big release. You are going to be the tech lead in an important project. So let's jump into our situation. The first one, after months and months of planning and dozens of sign-off for budget from the business side, your company is ready to roll the most demanding marketing project that has done in the last 5 years. You're expecting surges of 700% of your capacity due to the powerful and aggressive advertising campaign the company is leading. Your team has done the performance testing in before and considered it ready. That's great. But, red flag, 2 weeks before the rollout, one of your senior ops is getting alerts on the test environment about requests that are failing while doing the pre-release routine stress and endurance tests. So you're testing the endurance of these APIs, from how many hours they can go on how many transactions per second. And the ops team is actually finding issues that you can see there in point number 4. You're getting 429, too many requests, HTTP response code. You did some investigation to actually get that message, and now you're in a predicament. You have 2 weeks, you don't know what is going on. What are you going to do? Where is the issue happening? So now I'm asking the audience, does anyone have any idea what could be happening? It's still very much high level, but the 429 too many requests, it's something I saw at least 6 or 7 times in the last year. Well, I see no attempts from the community in the chat, so I will roll on. And you probably were thinking about it. Let's first consider what is the share load balancer. A quick recap here. The share load balancers have lower rate limits that help ensure platform stability. MuleSoft regularly monitors and scales these limits as necessary. Rate limits on share load balancers are applied according to a region. If you're deploying an application, 2 workers in multiple regions, the rate limit in each region might be different. If an application exceeds the rate limit for a shared load balancer, the load balancer returns a 429 service unavailable response. This is straight from the documentation. Now, that is the public available documentation. A little tip of advice from one of our support engineers I was working with: there is no way to increase the limit that you will have over another customers. So the shared load balancer per region, you cannot increase the limit. You can try a restart to discard that the issue is actually in the worker, but if the load is on the shared load balancer, that is still the issue. So if you are seeing the 429 in this scenario, you have exceeded the current rate limit. Let's recap all that information in 2 sentences. The first one, shared load balancer performance varies in time. There's no guarantee, and it also varies per region, and it's used for lower rate limits. If you want to know more about those, there's a support article there. That's the second link I'm showing in the screen. The first one is the public documentation. The second one is a public support article that was created to help you understanding how that works. My point here, first let's go to the dedicated load balancer, and then we go to the point. So the dedicated load balancer, as per the documentation, enables you to host your applications under a single domain, handle load balancing among different Cloud Hub workers that run. You can define the SSL, and you can configure some proxy rules. That's as per the documentation. For today, these are guidelines that I'm giving you. This is word of advice. These are not written rules, and this is not part of your MuleSoft SLAs, right? So consider that your dedicated load balancer, or consider the dedicated load balances whenever you reach more than 50 to 100 transactions per second per API. This again is because you need to think about your shared load balancer, what are the limitations per region, if you need to consider that levels of throughput. Again, the second point, unless you have millions of transactions per month, the out-of-the-box 2 workers dedicated load balancer should be enough. If you can consider, if you need more, you can consider just adding more workers to your dedicated load balancer, and that way you solve the issue. Use the dedicated load balancer for accessing the process and system APIs. And the trick here is that you want to think about network hairpinning, and you have process and system APIs in a private VPC. Outside, you will be exposed by the dedicated load balancer, and you want that when the experience API is calling your process, the process then is going to call the system, and all of that communication, you want to avoid it going every time to the same shared load balancer, for example, the one between the process and system APIs. That way you can save some latency as well. The last point there is a low-cost resource compared to the benefits. And I know what you're thinking, but before this is not a sales pitch. And there's a next part, and I know that many people here are actually architects, and you will want to see the architecture instead of a wall of text. And here you can see the physical reference architecture of Cloud Hub, the recommendation that is up there in Catalyst for you. And I have a question for you. In the center, there are 4 main square rectangles that you can see there. On top, they say worker, and then they have some DLBs. So how many DLBs are you seeing in the screen? How many VPCs you think you need? Think about it. There are 4 DLBs, right? Why would you need 4 DLBs? So again, this is a guideline. It's not for every single customer, but think about the private and internal. You want 1 DLB that is for your testing environments, for example, and you have internal DLB and public DLB that is hosting your experience APIs. And the same applies to production. So your production API, as a production environment, will have the internal DLB and the external DLB. Of course, this is not DLB itself, but think about the VPCs and how you redirect the traffic. And again, this is not for every single customer. This is not for every single use case. I have seen customers that are happy hosting their Cloud experience in Cloud, their experience APIs, and they do have low transactions per second, and they don't have regulations because they're not working with sensitive data. So in those cases, yeah, you can use the shared load balancer, for example, without any issue. Giving you a bit of retrospective, because I was talking a lot of different parts of the DLP, you need to evaluate, actually, if using the shared load balancer is a valid use case for you. If you don't want to think about the DLP first, think about the SLB. Is it enough? Is it what you need? And the reason I'm putting this is because it has been a problem for many of my customers, and I want to avoid it. I want to avoid this misconception going around. So if you're thinking about systems that have high throughput and you want a specific number to work on a specific time, the day in a specific region, think about using the dedicated load balancers. I'm adding here 2 resources. The one that you saw before, the physical architecture, you can see it in point number 2. And point number 3, you have the Cloud Hub networking that has been updated recently. You can see there one of the new diagrams that they have. Okay, with that said, I'm conscious of time. We're going to head over to case number 3. And we have a couple more going, but they're going to be far shorter after case 3. Now, here, CI/CD, we're going to focus on CI/CD, and considering that May was the mental health week, we're going to make a quick reference to that. So the situation, let's change from Atlanta, let's change from Madrid, Spain. Let's go now into a customer that is actually in the UK. So you receive a request for best practices from a customer. Imagine again, you're sitting down in your desk, you receive this request for getting best practices from a customer. You read the email, the information in the request, you prepare again with the questions you have in mind. You have the main doubts about what are going to be the questions in the session. And the only clue you have is that there's something related to hard-coded values in transformation rules, something related to error handling, to logging, and to CI/CD. The point number 2, you're already joining the call. What happens when you join that call? This customer is actually very angry. They are frustrated. The person is stating that the MuleSoft Anypoint solution is useless and that there is no way to do proper CI/CD and that the behavior is unacceptable. The person keeps raising the voice. There's no insults, there's no personal offenses. It's just a tone of voice, and you can tell in point number 3 that by the customer voice, the tone is angry. There's anger there. And this is something that we in the industry need to understand, that we have to put ourselves in other people's shoes. Probably they are under a lot of pressure to deliver. It's definitely not the best way to express it, but it's still a problem. It's not a problem for us at that time because you sit down, you listen, no defiance, you maintain your temper, not taking anything personally, because at the end of the day, this is a technical session, it's part of the day-to-day business, and you want to drive a solution. So with that said, imagine you pass that call, you survive, and you get a little bit of emotional toll. It's -10 to your peace of mind. You need to spend some time to recover. Maybe you get a short, brisk walk, or you make yourself a cup of tea, whatever helps you. Though, in this call, you manage to tackle the hard-coded values in transformation rules and the error handling. Great. But where we're going to jump today and now is to diagnosis of what else is happening. There is a pipeline taking 10 hours to finish deployment into the Anypoint platform. That means every time that you put a wrong XML, a wrong configuration file, a wrong YAML file, you put a white space there and you amend it, it will take 10 hours since the moment you push it, the pipeline picks it up and deploys it to the Anypoint platform. So there's something there, and this is when you think about the Aesop fables, the shepherd and the lion. You are now the Androcles. the guy that was seeing the lion's paw and saw that there was a huge thorn in the paw of the lion. The first thing you do, you understand what was going on, you put your mind together, and you follow up by email. You close the error transformation, the hard-coded values in transformation rule, the error handling, and you get a second meeting to review what the current process is for the CI/CD, for the actual pipeline. You join the meeting after, I think it was a couple of days this time. These are personal stories, actually. And the customer in this instance is at ease, is in peace at some extent. It's definitely nothing like the first encounter. The customer is asked by someone else from my team, and the reply is, yes, the information in your share was very useful. And that's what you get. So you move on to the next topic that you wanted for the call. There is still an issue going on, and you agree to run through to see what they're actually having. This is the picture. You can see the blur there, about the Azure DevOps pipeline they had in place. If you focus here on the stages, you can see in the center of the screen, stages, you see a lot of names. Test CA, test US, test SG, test MI, and you can tell by the initials in some instances that is Canada, is US, and then is when you start realizing that there's something else going on. You need at this point to ask as many questions as you can to understand what is it set up like that, what are the requirements, what are the constraints. For this particular customer, there was one API per country, and they moved recently from having only 2 countries in total to more than 15 countries. They added 15 APIs that were represented by country that they needed to deploy. So it's the same API, they're deploying to different countries, and they need to deploy that same API 16, 17 times. If you took a look at the pipeline, the DevOps, Azure DevOps they had in place, it was sequential for deployments. Additionally, on top of that, they were using the Mule Maven plugin by default behavior. That is, the skip verification is true, meaning that every step in that pipeline is going to wait until the application is correctly deployed to Cloud Hub. And again, you have 17 countries, you have APIs that are testing in different environments, and you also, on top of that, have to wait until each of the deployments is finished. That was the issue. And I know for some of you, this may be too obvious, but it's something that can happen for any organizations that are whether new to CI/CD or whether new to the tooling that they're working with. In retrospective, for this specific case, there were 2 main approaches. The first one was a tactical approach. You skip verification through, which basically gives you other sorts of, it's a trade-off, gives you other kinds of disadvantages. You will need to make sure somehow that your production is working as expected. In the case of this customer, their functional test was in place and they were okay with doing this. They skipped the verification so that they can, instead of waiting 10 hours, they can deploy in a matter of half an hour or so forth, as they were doing some sort of deploy, next deploy without checking. The strategic approach, of course, would be to actually have parallel branching per country, and you do some sort of property injection. There's many ways of doing this. This was just one of the advices that we provide to them. So you could use the Mule Maven plugin to even inject the properties if you wanted. They did have their own configuration server, so this is an approach they wanted to use. My advice here, if you see this situation, there's some resources. That's the importance of CI/CD. That's a 10 minutes video on First of Max. And there's something that is more interesting, Velocity 2009 conference from John Olspon and Paul Heyman. This was extremely popular. This is referenced in the Phoenix project by Jim King. And it's the 10 plus deploys per day, Dev and Ops, cooperation and FLIR. It's 12 years old and it's still up to date in some aspects. It's the pace of what DevOps is today. With that, we close the case study. This one is for you to take into account how you work on DevOps with MuleSoft. Just think about your automation pipeline. There's the test built there in the center and how you deploy. This is just to give you the big picture and the different roles. Now, I'm conscious of time. We're going to finish in 10 minutes more, and we're going to go over the rest of the case studies. Case study number 4, you are unable to use your CPU. So what is happening? It is observed that when running a cloud application, the CPU utilization does not appear to use all the CPU capacity. It may be that the CPU is maxing out at 50%. In some scenarios, it may appear the CPU is locked to 10 or 20%. This is a not fairly common scenario, but it's a scenario I have seen in the past. And here, some of the potential causes for it. 1, not enough concurrent load on the application. 2, related to threading that we talked about before. The application is single-threaded, using synchronous flows, using max concurrency on 1, setting an inbound connector to only 1 thread or 1 consumer. So you're limiting the capacity of your application so that then that worker is not able to run multiple threads on it. Or point number 3, potential cause number 3, is a 0.1 or 0.2 peak-core where CPU burst capability is already exhausted. Retrospective and resources in this case, it's recommended that applications require infrequent bursts of high CPU followed by low or idle time may work well on a 0.1 or 0.2 peak-core worker. For applications that require sustained high CPU, more than an hour continuously, a non-fractional peak-core worker is recommended. 1 peak-core and above do not have burst capability, and the full CPU capacity is available all the time, indefinitely. You probably want to check the details of this, and there's a support article there for you. Make sure you take a look. This is a topic that sometimes is not known. That was our case number 4. We're going to close with case number 5. It's around network, and then we're going to move to the nominations. That should be around 5 minutes. On network, the common pitfalls I have seen, there are organizations with a dedicated team for network configurations, but there is a significant set or group of organizations out there where during the setup, the network setup, there's no networking subject matter experts in the room. For example, and this is anecdotal fallacy, it's an anecdotal experience, it's a fallacy, is 5+ years ago, as a backend developer, I was setting up the network for my organization in a mid-sized company. I was actually not qualified for a network work if we're being using radical candor. There should have been a network professional there or some sort of engagement with a MuleSoft partner or with a professional services to help us doing the setup. What happens then is that the configuration will be probably revisit a couple of semesters or maybe years later because there's a review pending or there's an ongoing issue. Another case would be the employees that are working in other tasks will be dragged with priority into now you need to help us fix this networking issue now. Try to sort out whatever is happening in there. I'm not sure if this sounds familiar, but I have some more examples of non-urgent situations that happens when we think about network. The first one, we're running out of static IPs. We're releasing in a week. Why? What do we need to do now? And that's a non-urgent situation, right? The second one, our VPN is down. There is no traffic in there. There's no traffic in the VPN. What do we do? And there's some other scenarios. It worked for our 50 TPS pilot, but in a recent test with the VPC peering, it's not properly working for our 1 million TPS. We're also expecting a 10 million TPS on December. This was completely hypothetical scenario, but I remember working with banking industry, where this wouldn't sound as incredible as it is. We wanted vanity domains since the beginning, and we're trying to set them up now. Our testing environment is using a more economical network configuration than our production environment. But now, whether because you were having performance issues, whether because there's value realization, there is budget, whatever it is, the priorities change, and you want, as an organization, to have your performance tests to be as accurate as possible. So you want to have your testing environment as similar as possible to production. Now, in case you need it, there's 3 resources there that can help you related to all the things that we talk about. All you need to know about creating your first VPC, static IP best practices, and Anypoint VPN. With that, we have 5 minutes more, and we give the special mentions to 6, 7, 8, and 9 cases. What else could go wrong? Jenkins nominations 2021. So in the special mentions, you can see number 6 is the common service definition. When you think about common services, think about logging, auditing, exception handling, caching, securities via policies, and rate limiting. Those 2 are kind of obvious for most of the scenario. When you're in an organization, you need to define your common services. This is one of the first steps of your OBD, and it's part of what your C4E team should be doing. Number 7, SSO, onboarding and offboarding of your employees. How you're going to do it? It was the case that I was 6 months after I offboarded one of the companies I work with, and I was still having access to the Anypoint platform and to some of the Jenkins configuration servers that I work with, and so forth. You need to define an onboarding and offboarding process for employees, and that you can think about IDPs, SSO, or at least setting up some sort of MFA out of the box in the Anypoint platform. In this case, imagine that the employee will need to have the company phone to be able to access your Anypoint platform. Don't do that for automation users as Jenkins user. I wouldn't recommend it. Point number 8, configurations and secrets management. This applies mostly, it's a chimera, mostly for financial institutions and heavy regulated industries. It's not most of the cases, but you will think about a standalone. Think about HashiVault or other providers out there. And lastly, where was Gondor when the Westwall fell? He was fixing the VPN. This horrible joke is going to help you remember that when you are setting up VPNs, you need to have redundancy. And if that's not enough, check the documentation that is added there so that you avoid having only one VPN. When you're setting up your VPN, make sure that you are having redundant VPNs in case that anything goes wrong with one of them. Also think about the traffic. So in summary, we talk about performance, the search day case study, the ICD, CI/CD branching and hard coding, case of unable to use the CPU, the network, common service definition, SSO, secrets management, redundancies of your VPN connection. And lastly, number 10 is actually about you. What integration challenges you overcame in the past 2 months? How did you solve it? What was it? How did you manage to solve it? You can pop your questions into the chat. You can think about it. If you ever want to reach out, you can reach out to me on LinkedIn and tell me about your use case. And with that, we finished the session. I hope it hasn't been an ivory tower. You can let me know how was it. And once again, we use radical candor. You can express yourself, and thank you very much for the time.
Thanks, Angel. That was really interesting. Any questions? I'm gonna pass off on a question from Kevin Angel. He said, "What other books have you read that you think your audience would benefit from reading?"
Definitely anything related to Jenkins. I'm a fan, so I'm completely biased. Phoenix Project. You can think about the DevOps Handbook. You can think about the Unicorn. Some similarities between them. You can also go to the basics of continuous delivery, the one that is this red, the black screen editorial that is in the front face, the one that is made by Oldspawn and actually Hamilton. That one is very interesting. More than the book, at least check the conference. Is 1 hour, and you will get an insight of how all the DevOps movement is coming. And well, I will say the enterprise integration patterns, Gregor Hoffman. Oh, we have a feedback there already from Francis. The Unicron project is good. Yeah. And that's it. I cannot think of anything else now. Gregor Hopp is great. Yeah, I'm a follower as well. He's in AWS now.
Excellent. Anything else for Angel?
Nothing else from my side. Thank you again for letting me this chance to speak to the community, for holding for the whole session. I know it was more than 45 minutes.
No, it's good. It's good. Thanks, Angel.